Hazel was 68 years old, the kind of woman who always kept her garden in perfect bloom and her kitchen warm with the scent of freshly baked bread. She had been a school librarian for nearly 4 decades, the quiet heart of a small-town library where children's laughter mingled with the rustle of turning pages. Life had been steady for her. Gentle mornings, cups of tea, a few close friends who gathered on Thursdays for knitting and quiet conversation. But one cold winter morning, she woke with a pain so sharp in her knees that even walking to the kitchen felt like a climb up a steep hill. It wasn't the kind of ache she could ignore. This was deeper, heavier, as if someone had quietly tied weights to her bones in the night. Hazel told herself it was just winter stiffness and that a little stretching would help. But days passed and the pain lingered. Then came the shortness of breath when she walked to the post office, and a strange tightness in her chest that made her stop mid-step. She brushed it off, unwilling to worry her daughter, Emily, who called every Sunday to check in. Yet, in the quiet of her living room, Hazel felt a small ripple of fear begin to spread. The real turning point came one afternoon while she was rearranging books on her favorite shelf. She bent down to pick up a volume that had slipped to the floor, but when she tried to stand, the pain shot up her leg and into her hip, taking her breath away. For a moment, she clutched the side of the shelf, staring at the book in her hand, wondering how something so simple had become so difficult. That evening, she sat by the window watching the snow fall and thought, when did I get this fragile? The question lodged itself deep in her mind. The next week, at her annual checkup, her doctor gently told her what she had been avoiding. Hazel, your blood pressure's too high, your cholesterol isn't where we want it, and you've been carrying inflammation for quite a while now. It was the word inflammation that made Hazel sit up straighter. She'd read enough to know it wasn't just about swollen joints. It touched everything: the heart, the brain, even the immune system. The doctor suggested some changes to her diet, more walking, less processed food. But what stayed with Hazel was his quiet warning. You can't keep ignoring these signs. Your body's speaking to you. That night, Hazel couldn't sleep. She thought about the days when she could walk all the way to the farmer's market and back without stopping. She thought about her late husband, Jack, who had always told her, "The body's like a house, Hazel. If you don't keep up the little repairs, the big ones will cost you." She realized she had been putting off her own repairs for far too long. Somewhere between looking after everyone else and convincing herself she was still fine, she had let her own health fade into the background. The following weekend, Emily visited. Over tea, Hazel finally admitted how bad the pain had become. Emily listened quietly, then reached into her tote bag and pulled out a small jar filled with a reddish powder. "This," Emily said with a smile, "is cayenne pepper. I started adding a pinch to my soups and eggs a while ago. You wouldn't believe what it's done for my energy." Hazel raised an eyebrow. "You mean the hot stuff you used to avoid as a kid?" Emily nodded. "That's the one. But it's not just heat, Mom. It's healing. I think it could help you." Hazel laughed softly, shaking her head. "I'm 68, Emily. I doubt a little spice is going to solve what's wrong with me." But Emily went on, telling her about how cayenne pepper was rich in compounds that could ease inflammation, boost circulation, even help with digestion. She talked about its history, how people had used it for centuries as a kind of natural medicine. Hazel found herself listening more closely than she expected. There was something comforting about the idea that help could come from something so small, so ordinary. That evening, Hazel sprinkled a pinch of the bright red powder into her vegetable soup. She expected it to taste harsh, but instead it brought a warmth that seemed to bloom in her chest. The flavor was gentle but alive, almost as if it were waking something up inside her. She ate slowly, feeling the heat linger, not in a burning way, but in a way that made her feel lighter. It was such a small thing, but for the first time in months, she felt a flicker of hope. The next morning, she made her tea and sat with her notebook. She began jotting down how she felt each day, her pain, her energy, her mood. It wasn't that she believed cayenne pepper would work miracles overnight, but she wanted to pay attention. She had spent too many years letting symptoms pass without question, assuming they were just part of getting older. This time, she wanted to see if small changes could make a big difference. A week passed, then 2. Hazel started noticing little shifts. The pain in her knees was still there, but it wasn't quite as sharp in the mornings. Her walks to the post office felt less like a chore, and in the evenings she found herself sitting with a book again instead of collapsing into bed early. Emily called to check in, and Hazel admitted, almost sheepishly, "I think that little jar of yours is doing something." Emily's voice on the other end was warm. It's not just the pepper, Mom, it's you taking charge again. Hazel smiled at that. She realized it had been a long time since she'd thought of herself as someone who could take charge of her own health. In a way, the cayenne pepper was just a spark, a reminder that the answers didn't always have to come in the form of a pill or a complicated treatment. Sometimes they came in the form of a small red spice, waiting quietly in the back of the cupboard, ready to change the way you felt about your own body. And so, in her quiet kitchen on a winter morning, Hazel made a promise to herself. She would listen to her body, she would make space for small, nourishing habits, and she would keep an open mind about where healing might come from, even if it came in the form of a fiery little pinch of red. Hazel had always thought of her kitchen spices as nothing more than flavor makers. The jars of cinnamon, basil, rosemary, and paprika lined neatly on her counter were, in her mind, for cooking, nothing more. The cayenne pepper jar, in particular, was something she had barely touched. She remembered buying it years ago after seeing a recipe in a magazine for spicy lentil soup, but the recipe had been made once and forgotten. Ever since, the jar sat quietly in the spice rack, the red powder inside still vivid but unused, almost like a tiny jar of sunset waiting to be poured into a dish. But now, things were different. Emily's visit had stirred something in her, not just curiosity, but a sense of possibility. Hazel had never been one to jump on health fads. She believed in balance, in a little of everything in moderation, and she certainly wasn't someone who fell for quick fixes. Still, she couldn't deny the quiet hope that had taken root since Emily spoke about cayenne pepper that afternoon. The way her daughter described it, gentle but insistent, with the same tone she'd used years ago when encouraging Hazel to plant tomatoes in her garden, made Hazel want to try. Her first real experiment began on a gray Tuesday morning. The air outside was brittle with cold, the kind that made her joints ache the moment she stepped outside. She decided to make oatmeal, the comforting kind she always topped with honey and cinnamon. But this time she reached for the cayenne pepper jar. She hesitated, her fingers hovering over the lid. "Just a pinch," Emily had said. Hazel twisted the cap and tapped in the tiniest amount, stirring it in with the honey. The smell was faint but different, warm and earthy in a way she couldn't quite describe. She took her first spoonful and paused. It wasn't unpleasant. The sweetness of the honey wrapped itself around the heat, making it feel almost like a warm whisper rather than a burn. Over the next few days, Hazel found herself slipping the red powder into unexpected places. A dash into scrambled eggs, a sprinkle over roasted carrots, even a tiny pinch into her afternoon cup of hot cocoa when she was feeling adventurous. She didn't notice a dramatic change at first. But she did notice something. The mornings didn't feel quite as heavy. The ache in her knees was still there, but it wasn't biting quite so hard when she stood up from her chair. That Friday, she walked to the post office as she always did. It was only a few blocks from her home, but lately she had started to dread the trip, knowing she would arrive slightly winded and need to rest before walking back. This time, she noticed her steps were lighter. She still took her time, but she didn't need to stop halfway. She chalked it up to a good day, but a small voice inside her whispered, "Maybe it's the pepper." A week later, she found herself in Dr. Simons's office for a follow-up. He was a kind man in his 70s, with silver hair and a voice that could make even difficult news feel gentle. Hazel told him about Emily's visit and the cayenne pepper experiment. She half expected him to chuckle, but instead, he nodded thoughtfully. "You'd be surprised," he said. "That little spice has been helping people long before we had modern medicine. It's not a cure-all, but it can do more than just add flavor." He explained how it might help with circulation, inflammation, even mood. Hazel felt herself leaning forward as though every word were a small confirmation that she was on the right path. When she got home, she thought about what Dr. Simons had said. She wasn't ready to declare herself healed or to believe in miracles, but she was starting to feel a shift, not just in her body, but in her mindset. For so long, she had been in the habit of seeing health as something fixed by doctors, prescriptions, and structured advice. But here she was, finding small improvements from something as humble as a pinch of spice. It felt empowering in a way she hadn't expected. One evening, Emily called. Hazel told her about the post office walk and the visit with Dr. Simons. "It's not magic, Emily," Hazel said, "but I think it's making a difference." Emily's voice was bright with pride. "That's the point, Mom. It's not about magic. It's about giving your body what it needs and letting it respond." Hazel realized her daughter was right. This wasn't about expecting an overnight transformation. It was about small changes, the kind that stack quietly over time until one day you wake up and realize you've climbed a hill you didn't think you could. A few days later, Hazel invited her neighbor Marjorie over for tea. Marjorie was a cheerful woman in her early 70s who loved to talk about her grandkids. When Hazel served the tea, she also brought out a plate of sliced apples sprinkled lightly with cayenne pepper and cinnamon. Marjorie looked skeptical at first, but took a bite. Her eyes widened. "Well, that's unexpected, but it's lovely." The two women laughed, and Hazel felt a quiet satisfaction. She was sharing something that had become more than just a new flavor. It was part of her own quiet journey back to herself. That night, as Hazel rinsed the teacups and put away the leftover apple slices, she thought about how far she had come from the woman who had ignored her body's warning signs. She was still the same Hazel who loved books, gardens, and warm kitchens, but now she was also someone who had decided to listen to her body, to her daughter, and even to the whispers of a little jar of red powder. The change wasn't dramatic or sudden, but it was real. And so the tiny spice that had once sat forgotten on her shelf was no longer just a cooking ingredient. It had become a companion in her days, a small reminder that healing often begins with the smallest of steps. Hazel didn't know exactly where this journey would lead, but for the first time in a long while, she felt ready to find out. It had been nearly 3 weeks since Hazel first began her quiet cayenne pepper experiment. At first, she thought she was imagining things, the small shifts, the slightly easier mornings, but lately there had been moments that caught her by surprise. Like the afternoon she dropped her knitting needle under the sofa and instinctively bent to retrieve it. For months, that simple act had been met with a sharp protest from her knees, the kind of pain that made her freeze in place. But this time she reached down, found the needle, and rose again with only a faint twinge. She didn't tell anyone right away. Hazel was cautious about declaring victories too soon, but in the privacy of her own kitchen, she allowed herself a small smile. She thought about the morning stiffness that had once made her dread getting out of bed. It was still there, but gentler now, as though the ache had lost some of its sharp edges. When she stood at the sink washing dishes, she no longer felt the same heavy pull in her lower back and hips. It was as if her body had decided to loosen its grip on the pain it had been holding for so long. One chilly Saturday, she bundled herself in her thick scarf and decided to visit the farmer's market. The stalls were just beginning to set up, steam rising from coffee cups in the brisk air. She walked slowly, stopping to chat with the man who sold fresh honey and the woman who baked crusty loaves of bread. Halfway through the market, she realized something. She hadn't thought about her knees once since leaving the house. She had been walking, browsing, smiling, and the usual background hum of pain had been replaced by a kind of quiet comfort. When she returned home, Hazel made herself a pot of vegetable stew, chopping carrots, celery, and sweet potatoes with a rhythm she hadn't felt in months. Before adding the final ingredients, she took the cayenne pepper jar from the shelf. She didn't measure this time, just a small, confident sprinkle into the pot. The red powder bloomed against the golden broth, swirling into the vegetables like a secret ingredient only she knew. As she stirred, she thought about how such a small thing could make such a difference. That evening, Emily called. Hazel told her about the market and the stew, about how she'd walked without thinking about the pain. Emily's voice was warm with happiness. "See, Mom, that's what I've been trying to tell you. It's not about the spice being some magic cure. It's about how it works with your body, helping it do what it's meant to do." Hazel listened, nodding quietly. She thought about how, in her younger days, she had always trusted her body without question. Lately, she had felt as though that trust had been broken. But maybe, just maybe, they were learning to trust each other again. A few days later, Hazel had her monthly book club meeting at Marjorie's house. As she climbed the 3 steps to the front porch, she noticed again how much easier it felt. No grimace, no breath held against the pain. Inside, the women gathered with their tea and homemade muffins, discussing the month's novel. When Hazel reached for her cup on the coffee table, she caught herself bending and rising without hesitation. She glanced at Marjorie, who noticed her ease. "You're moving better these days," Marjorie said with a knowing smile. Hazel smiled back but kept her secret for now. One evening, after washing the dinner dishes, Hazel settled into her armchair with her knitting. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting a warm glow across the room. She thought about the days before cayenne pepper, how pain had colored nearly every movement, how even the smallest tasks had felt like quiet battles. Now those battles seemed fewer, and when they came, they were easier to win. She wasn't pain-free, but she no longer felt trapped by it. Later that week, she returned to Dr. Simons for her scheduled visit. As he checked her blood pressure and listened to her heartbeat, Hazel mentioned the changes she had noticed. She spoke about the market trip, the knitting, the bending without sharp pain. Dr. Simons leaned back in his chair, thoughtful. "You're describing something I've seen before," he said. "When inflammation starts to settle, the whole body feels it. You've given it a nudge in the right direction." Hazel nodded slowly, letting his words sink in. On her way home, she stopped at the little grocery store by the corner. In her basket went fresh spinach, a loaf of whole grain bread, a jar of olive oil, and a brand new jar of cayenne pepper. She realized the old jar at home was nearly empty, something she wouldn't have imagined a month ago. The cashier, a young man with an easy grin, rang up her items and held up the pepper. "You like it spicy?" he asked. Hazel chuckled softly. "Not really," she said, "but it seems to like me." That night, Hazel made herself a simple dinner of scrambled eggs with sautéed spinach. She sprinkled in cayenne without hesitation now, as if it were as natural as adding salt. She sat at her small kitchen table, the plate warm in front of her, and took her first bite. The gentle heat spread through her mouth, then down into her chest. She thought about all the mornings she had woken with dread at the thought of standing, about all the afternoons she had pushed through pain just to make it to bedtime. Tonight, she felt something different, lightness, a quiet sense of possibility. It wasn't that cayenne pepper had taken all her pain away, but it had done something just as important. It had reminded her that change was possible, that her body could still respond, still improve, even in her late 60s. And perhaps most importantly, it had reminded her that healing didn't always arrive in big, dramatic gestures. Sometimes it came in a small red jar, sitting quietly on a kitchen shelf, waiting for someone to remember it. Hazel closed her eyes for a moment, listening to the wind outside. She thought about tomorrow, about the walk she might take, the stew she might make, the phone call she might share with Emily. She thought about her knees, her back, her hands. She smiled. For the first time in a long time, they didn't feel like her enemies. They felt like hers again. Winter had always been Hazel's favorite season for curling up by the fire with a good book, but it also brought its fair share of trouble. The cold air outside and the dry heat inside seemed to conspire against her lungs. Each year, without fail, she found herself fighting off at least one lingering winter cold. This year was no different. One chilly morning, she woke with a heavy head, her sinuses blocked tight, and her breathing labored. The simple act of drawing in air felt like trying to sip through a straw. Hazel shuffled to the kitchen, pulling her robe close around her. Her kettle whistled softly, and she poured hot water over a tea bag, hoping the steam would loosen the stubborn pressure in her chest. But as she sat at the table, staring into her cup, she remembered Emily's words about cayenne pepper helping more than just aches and pains. "It wakes things up," Emily had said. Hazel wondered if it could wake up her airways too. She reached for the familiar little jar, tapping just the smallest pinch into her tea. The bright red powder swirled on the surface for a moment before melting into the amber liquid. She hesitated. Tea with cayenne was not something she had ever imagined drinking. But she brought the cup to her lips anyway, taking a careful sip. The heat hit her tongue first, then spread down her throat, warm and alive. Within minutes, Hazel felt a subtle change. The stuffiness in her nose began to loosen, and she could draw in slightly deeper breaths without that trapped, tight feeling. Intrigued, she added cayenne to her lunch later that day, a simple vegetable soup with carrots, onions, and a few leftover potatoes. This time, she was more generous with her sprinkle. The warmth from the pepper seemed to travel through her chest, and by the time she set her spoon down, her nose had begun to clear. She took a deep breath, surprised at how much easier it felt. It wasn't instant magic, but it was enough to make her sit back in her chair, eyes closed, savoring the relief. The next morning, she tried something new. She made her usual scrambled eggs and avocado toast, but with a dusting of cayenne on top. The spice lifted the flavors, but more than that, it gave her a sense of opening, of air moving freely again. She went for a short walk afterward, her scarf pulled tight against the wind, and noticed she wasn't as winded climbing the gentle slope toward the post office. Later that week, Marjorie stopped by to return a book she'd borrowed. The moment she stepped inside, she saw the box of tissues on Hazel's coffee table. "Still fighting that cold?" Marjorie asked sympathetically. Hazel smiled. "Not so much now. I've been experimenting." She poured them both mugs of warm lemon water with honey and, of course, a dash of cayenne. Marjorie eyed the mugs suspiciously but took a sip. Her eyebrows lifted. "Well, that's a surprise. It's actually nice." Hazel chuckled. "And it works, clears me right up." By the following week, Hazel's cold had run its course, but she kept the cayenne habit going. Not just for the relief it brought when she was sick, but for the way it seemed to keep her airways open and her chest light. She began to notice that on the mornings she added cayenne to her tea or breakfast, she felt more awake, more ready to step outside into the crisp winter air. Breathing no longer felt like a chore. It felt like something she could enjoy again. One afternoon, Emily called. Hazel told her about the tea, the soup, the unexpected relief. Emily laughed. "I told you it wakes things up. That's the capsaicin working. It gets things moving, even mucus. I do it every time I feel something coming on." Hazel thought about that, about how something so small could make such a tangible difference. It wasn't that she had been living with terrible breathing problems, but she realized now how much she had been accepting low-level congestion as normal. That night, she stood at her kitchen counter making a batch of roasted vegetables. Sweet potatoes, Brussels sprouts, and carrots, all tossed with olive oil, sea salt, and just enough cayenne to make the air in her kitchen smell alive. As they roasted, she thought about how much this little spice had become part of her daily life. It was no longer an experiment, it was a habit, one that connected her not only to her health, but to a sense of agency she hadn't felt in years. Her thoughts drifted to Jack, her late husband, who had always believed in the body's ability to heal with the right help. He used to make what he called fire broth whenever one of them caught a cold, a simple chicken broth with garlic, ginger, and a whisper of chili. Hazel realized now that maybe he had been onto something. Maybe, without knowing it, he had been passing down the same wisdom she was rediscovering. The next morning, as the sun spilled through her kitchen window, Hazel poured herself a glass of warm lemon water and added her now familiar pinch of cayenne. She took a slow sip, closed her eyes, and breathed deeply. The air moved easily, without the resistance she had felt just a few weeks ago. It was such a simple thing, but to Hazel, it felt like a gift, one she could give herself every single day. And in that moment, she realized something important. Health wasn't just about living without pain or illness. It was also about finding the small ways to breathe easier, to feel lighter, to wake up to the world around you. And for her, that journey had begun with a little red spice in a jar. It had been a little over a month since Hazel first reached for the dusty jar of cayenne pepper. At first, her goal had been simple, to see if it could ease her aching knees and help her breathe more freely during the stubborn winter cold. But somewhere along the way, she began to notice something else, something she hadn't been expecting. It started one morning when she pulled on her favorite navy cardigan. She had worn it less often in recent years because the buttons strained a little too tightly across her middle. But this time, it slipped on more easily. The difference was subtle, barely enough to notice, but enough to make her pause. She glanced in the mirror, tilting her head. She murmured to herself, running her hand over the fabric. Hazel had never been overly concerned with her weight. She valued feeling good more than fitting into a certain size. But the truth was, over the past few years, the pounds had crept on little by little, settling stubbornly around her waist and hips. She had blamed it on age, slower metabolism, and the fact that she wasn't as active as she used to be. And yet lately, something felt different. Her walks to the post office seemed easier. Her body felt lighter, somehow less sluggish. The realization deepened a few days later when she bent down to retrieve a jar from the bottom kitchen cupboard. Usually, standing back up required a moment to catch her breath, but this time she rose without thinking about it. Her energy seemed to last longer into the afternoon, and she found herself doing little things she had stopped doing years ago, organizing her pantry, wiping down the top shelves, even rearranging the potted plants in her sunroom. It was during her weekly phone call with Emily that Hazel finally mentioned it. "You know, I think I might have lost a bit of weight," she said, almost as if confessing a secret. Emily's laughter bubbled through the phone. "That doesn't surprise me. Cayenne can rev up your metabolism. It's like giving your body a little furnace boost." Hazel raised an eyebrow. "A furnace, huh?" Emily explained how the gentle heat from cayenne pepper could encourage the body to burn a few more calories throughout the day, even while resting. It wasn't about crash diets or starving yourself. It was about nudging the body into working a little more efficiently. The thought intrigued Hazel. She had never been one for harsh diets. She had seen too many friends lose weight quickly, only to gain it back just as fast, their energy drained and spirits low. But this was different. She wasn't depriving herself. She was simply adding a pinch of something warm and alive to her meals. and the changes were sneaking in without the usual struggle. One chilly afternoon, she decided to put her theory to the test. She bundled up and walked the long way to the small grocer at the far end of town. The route took her past the park, where the bare trees reached into the pale winter sky. By the time she reached the store, she realized she had walked farther than she had in months without feeling drained. She even had enough energy to carry her groceries home without stopping for a break. That night, she made a hearty quinoa salad with roasted vegetables and chickpeas. Before serving, she drizzled it with olive oil, lemon juice, and her now signature sprinkle of cayenne. As she ate, she thought about how her meals had changed. Without even planning it, she had started choosing fresher foods, not because she was on a diet, but because her body seemed to want them. The heat from the cayenne made vegetables taste brighter, soups feel heartier, and even simple toast with avocado seemed like a treat. Over the next couple of weeks, Hazel noticed another shift. Her appetite had changed. She still enjoyed her meals, but she didn't feel the same urge to snack between them. She found herself feeling satisfied for longer after eating, the warmth of the cayenne lingering like a quiet reminder that she'd had enough. She suspected this too was part of the secret, slower digestion and a natural sense of fullness that didn't require willpower. One afternoon, as she stood at her kitchen counter slicing red peppers for a stir-fry, she caught her reflection in the darkened window. She paused, knife in hand, and took herself in. There was a softness to her face that came from feeling better, not from the absence of years. Her posture was straighter, her movements less hesitant. She realized she wasn't just feeling lighter in her body, she was feeling lighter in her spirit. During her next visit with Dr. Simons, she mentioned the changes she'd been noticing. He listened carefully, nodding. "That's what happens when the body starts working with you instead of against you," he said. "Better circulation, less inflammation, a slightly faster metabolism. It all adds up over time." Hazel smiled, thinking about how those small things were quietly reshaping her days. That evening, Hazel brewed herself a cup of chamomile tea and sat at her kitchen table with her journal. She wrote about the cardigan that fit again, the long walk to the store, the groceries carried without stopping. She wrote about the warmth in her meals, the ease in her movements, the energy that carried her past the afternoon slump. And as she wrote, she realized something. She had started this journey looking for relief from pain, but she was finding so much more. It wasn't about chasing youth or fitting into old clothes. It was about reclaiming the simple pleasures of movement, energy, and confidence. And if that came with the help of a little red spice in a jar, then Hazel was more than happy to keep sprinkling it on everything she could. Hazel had always had a temperamental stomach, not in a dramatic, rush to the doctor way, but in the subtle, lingering discomfort that often followed a meal. Sometimes it was a dull heaviness, other times a slow, uncomfortable bloating that made her loosen the waistband of her skirt when no one was looking. Over the years, she had simply learned to live with it, blaming it on age, slower digestion, and the odd indulgence in bread or cheese. One Sunday afternoon, after a simple lunch of vegetable soup and whole grain bread, Hazel found herself sitting in her armchair feeling that familiar heaviness settle in her middle. It was the kind of discomfort that made her want to lie down and wait for it to pass. But as she sat there, her eyes wandered to the small spice rack near her kitchen counter. Her gaze landed on the cayenne pepper. She thought about what Emily had once mentioned, that some people used cayenne not just for flavor or pain relief, but to help digestion. She decided to try something simple. She brewed herself a cup of warm water with a squeeze of lemon and just the tiniest pinch of cayenne pepper. The heat spread slowly down her throat, and within 20 minutes, Hazel noticed something surprising. The tight, heavy feeling had eased, and her belly felt less tense. It was such a small shift, but it was enough to make her take note. The next day, she experimented again. For breakfast, she made her usual scrambled eggs, adding a sprinkle of cayenne before they set in the pan. It gave them a pleasant warmth, and afterward, she realized she didn't have the usual mid-morning sluggishness that often followed her heavier breakfasts. She felt light enough to take a short walk in the garden, checking on the frost-dusted rosemary and the few stubborn pansies still holding their heads high in the winter air. That week, Hazel began making small adjustments. Instead of skipping lunch when she feared it might upset her stomach, she started having simple, nourishing meals like roasted carrots, quinoa, and chickpeas, always with a gentle dusting of cayenne. Not only did the warmth make the food taste more vibrant, but she also noticed she was digesting her meals more comfortably. Gone were the afternoons spent rubbing her belly in mild frustration. waiting for the discomfort to fade. One evening, Marjorie came over for supper. Hazel served lentil stew with whole grain bread, and of course, she had stirred in a pinch of cayenne while it simmered. As they ate, Marjorie remarked, "There's something about this that feels easy to eat, comforting." Hazel smiled to herself. "Maybe it's the spice," she said. She didn't launch into a speech about digestion or circulation. She just let the meal speak for itself. The change was gradual but steady. Hazel began to notice she wasn't relying on antacids as often. The little chewable tablets that once sat permanently by her bedside table now stayed untouched for days, even weeks. When she mentioned this to Dr. Simons at her next appointment, he smiled knowingly. "Your digestive system responds to warmth and stimulation," he said. "Cayenne can encourage the stomach to produce more of the good stuff, enzymes, juices that help break down food. It can also keep things moving along." Hazel thought about that as she walked home from the clinic, her scarf tucked under her chin. She had always imagined digestion as something passive, something that just happened. But now she realized it was an active, living process that needed care and attention, just like her joints, her lungs, or her heart. And this small red spice was helping her give it exactly that. The real test came during a chilly Saturday afternoon when Hazel attended her church's winter luncheon. The spread was as generous as ever: roast meats, creamy casseroles, crusty bread, and pies of every kind. Hazel served herself modestly, but didn't avoid the heavier dishes entirely. In the past, such a meal would have left her sluggish and uncomfortably full for hours. But this time, she went home, made herself a warm cup of water with lemon and cayenne, and waited. The discomfort never came. She felt comfortably full, but light enough to sit at her desk and write a letter to her sister without the usual lethargy pulling her toward the couch. It was such a simple victory, but it made her feel quietly triumphant. She no longer had to brace herself for the unpleasant aftermath of a meal she enjoyed. That evening, as she sat by the fire with her knitting, Hazel thought about how far she had come in just a few months. She had started this journey because of her aching knees and stubborn winter congestion, but now she was discovering benefits she hadn't even been looking for. She realized that her relationship with food was changing, not just in what she ate, but in how she felt afterward. Meals no longer came with the unspoken question, "Will this make me uncomfortable later?" Instead, they were becoming what they had always been meant to be: a source of comfort, nourishment, and quiet joy. And each time she reached for the little jar of cayenne pepper, she felt like she was giving herself a gift, not just of flavor, but of health. By the time February arrived, winter had settled deep into Hazel's small town. The air was crisp, the snow on the sidewalks packed down into pale, glittering paths. In years past, this was the season when Hazel's energy would begin to fray. She could almost mark it on the calendar: the sniffles that lingered, the mild sore throat that never seemed to fully go away, the way a simple cold could drain her for weeks. But this year felt different. Hazel noticed it one morning when she walked to the post office in a soft flurry of snow. As she stepped inside the warm air, she heard the clerk, Mrs. Donovan, sniffling behind the counter. "It's making the rounds again," Mrs. Donovan said, shaking her head. "Half the town's down with it." Hazel nodded sympathetically, but as she walked home, she realized something. While others were complaining about colds and lingering coughs, she'd been remarkably well this winter. No endless runny nose, no weeks of fatigue. She didn't want to tempt fate by saying it out loud, but she couldn't help wondering if her new cayenne habit had something to do with it. After all, she'd been adding it to nearly every meal for weeks: scrambled eggs, hearty soups, roasted vegetables, even her afternoon tea. She'd read that it was packed with vitamin C and beta-carotene, both known to strengthen the immune system. And maybe it wasn't just the nutrients. The way the cayenne warmed her body from the inside seemed to do more than chase away the winter chill. It felt as though it was quietly fortifying her. One blustery afternoon, Emily called. "It's chaos here," she sighed. "Everyone at work is coughing. I think I'm next." Hazel told her about how she'd been feeling. Emily's response was quick. "That doesn't surprise me, Mom. Cayenne's got all sorts of compounds that help your immune system stay on its toes. You're giving your body a head start." Hazel thought about that later as she spooned cayenne into her vegetable stew. She liked the idea that she was doing something active to protect herself, not in a grand, dramatic way, but in the quiet, daily act of choosing what went into her food. That week, Marjorie stopped by with a basket of homemade bread and a red nose that spoke of her own recent cold. Hazel made them both mugs of warm lemon water with a dash of cayenne. Marjorie took a sip and smiled weakly. "I could get used to this," she said. Hazel smiled back, secretly pleased to be sharing not just a drink, but perhaps a little defense against the season's ailments. The real test came when the church announced their annual winter bake sale. It was always a crowded, bustling affair held in the parish hall, with tables piled high with cookies, pies, and jars of preserves. People came and went, greeting friends and neighbors with hugs and handshakes. It was also, Hazel knew, a perfect opportunity for colds to spread like wildfire. She went anyway, wrapped in her navy coat, a scarf tucked snugly around her neck. The hall was warm and loud, the air sweet with the smell of cinnamon and sugar. She bought a loaf of banana bread, chatted with friends, and even helped pack up some unsold pies. A week later, she realized she'd emerged unscathed, no sore throat, no sniffles. In past years, she might have picked up a bug without even knowing from whom. But this year, she seemed to be sailing through winter with her head held high. When she mentioned this to Dr. Simons during her next visit, he nodded with interest. "It's hard to prove these things exactly," he said, "but there's no doubt cayenne pepper is rich in antioxidants and vitamins that can support your immune system. And the fact that you're feeling stronger, moving more, and eating well, those are all part of the same picture." Hazel left the clinic that day with a quiet glow of pride. She wasn't just lucky, she was making choices that were paying off. One frosty evening, Hazel sat by the fire with her knitting, a cup of cayenne-spiked tea beside her. She thought about how winter used to feel like a long season to endure, cold, slow, and laced with the worry of getting sick. But now she felt more resilient. It wasn't that she believed cayenne pepper was a magic shield against every illness, but it had become part of a rhythm, a way of caring for herself that added up to something bigger than the sum of its parts. She realized then that health wasn't just the absence of sickness, it was the presence of strength, energy, and readiness. And every pinch of cayenne she added to her meals was a small vote for her own well-being. Hazel had always taken her eyesight for granted. In her younger years, she could thread a needle without even thinking about it, or read the fine print on a seed packet without squinting. But over the last decade, she'd noticed the slow, creeping changes that seemed to come for everyone eventually. The print in her books had started to blur if she read for too long. Driving at night was harder, the oncoming headlights making her eyes water. And sometimes, in bright sunlight, she'd find herself shading her eyes just to make out the shapes in front of her. She chalked it up to getting older, buying a better lamp for her reading chair, and keeping her glasses within easy reach. But deep down, she worried. She'd seen friends and neighbors struggle with cataracts and macular degeneration, conditions that often stole the joy of reading or the freedom to drive. Hazel wasn't ready to give up either. One rainy afternoon, as she sat by the kitchen table sipping her now familiar lemon and cayenne tea, Emily called. They talked about everything from the garden to Emily's work until the conversation drifted to Emily's friend from yoga class, who'd recently been diagnosed with early-stage cataracts. "She's younger than you, Mom," Emily said, concern in her voice. "It really made me think about how much our eyes go through." Hazel listened quietly. Then Emily added, "You know, cayenne pepper's got compounds, lutein and zeaxanthin, that help protect the eyes. They're like little bodyguards for your retina." Hazel raised an eyebrow. "In my spice jar?" Emily laughed. "Yes, in your spice jar. It's not just about pain relief or circulation, it's about protecting what you've got before it's gone." That night, Hazel sat in her armchair, knitting needles in hand, thinking about what Emily had said. She thought about her father, who had struggled with his vision in his later years, and how frustrated he'd been when he could no longer read the newspaper without a magnifying glass. She thought about the stack of novels by her bed, waiting patiently for her attention. And she decided that if a pinch of cayenne could offer even a little help, she would gladly keep sprinkling it on her food. The following week, she made roasted sweet potatoes with olive oil, rosemary, and her now signature dash of cayenne. As she ate, she imagined those nutrients traveling through her body, finding their way to her eyes, standing guard against the slow wear and tear of time. It was a comforting thought that something so small could be part of her long-term care. One sunny afternoon, Hazel decided to walk down to the library. The early spring light was bright, the kind that usually made her squint, but she noticed she was handling it better than usual. She still wore her sunglasses, of course, but the harshness didn't seem to cut into her eyes the way it sometimes did. She wasn't sure if it was the cayenne or just a good day, but she chose to believe it was part of her new way of caring for herself. Marjorie noticed too, a week later when they sat together on Hazel's porch with mugs of tea. "You're not shielding your eyes as much as you used to," Marjorie observed. Hazel smiled. "Maybe my spice jar is working overtime," she said lightly. She didn't expect miracles, but she found joy in the possibility that her small daily habit was helping her in ways she couldn't see, or rather ways she could still see. When she mentioned her curiosity to Dr. Simons at her next appointment, he nodded. Diet plays a bigger role in eye health than most people realize. Antioxidants, vitamins A and C, carotenoids, they all help protect the retina from damage over time. And cayenne has plenty of those. Hazel felt reassured. It wasn't just a whimsical idea from Emily. There was real truth behind it. That evening, Hazel sat by her kitchen window watching the fading sunset. The sky melted from pale gold into soft lavender, the edges of the clouds glowing. She thought about how easily she could have missed such beauty if her eyesight were gone. She realized that protecting her vision wasn't just about avoiding trouble. It was about preserving the moments she loved most. Reading a good book on a rainy day, watching the snow drift past her window, seeing Emily smile when she came to visit. And so, with each meal, she kept up her habit. Not with the urgency of someone chasing a cure, but with the quiet faith of someone tending a garden, knowing that what you nurture today will reward you in the years to come. Her cayenne jar might have looked small and unassuming, but to Hazel, it had become a daily reminder. Take care of what matters before it's too late. Hazel had never been the sort of woman to fuss over beauty creams or expensive treatments. Her skincare routine, if it could be called that, was a simple bar of soap, a soft towel, and the occasional dab of cold cream on winter nights. She wore her years openly, with fine laugh lines around her eyes and the gentle creases on her hands that came from decades of gardening, knitting, and turning the pages of beloved books. But one morning, as she stood at the bathroom mirror brushing her hair, she paused. Her skin seemed different. It wasn't that the years had vanished or that her wrinkles had smoothed away overnight, but there was a certain freshness there, a quiet glow that she hadn't noticed in a long time. The pale winter dryness that usually clung to her cheeks was softer now, and her complexion looked warmer, more alive. Hazel didn't think much of it at first. She assumed it was the better lighting from the morning sun spilling through the frosted window. But over the next few weeks, she caught herself noticing it again, while washing her hands in the kitchen sink, while adjusting her scarf in a shop window reflection, even when she leaned in to kiss Emily's cheek during a weekend visit. There was something different about her skin, and she couldn't quite put her finger on it. It was during that same visit that Emily noticed too. "Mom, your skin looks great," she said, tilting her head and studying Hazel's face as they sat together in the living room. Hazel laughed softly. "Great? At my age?" Emily grinned. "I mean it. There's a brightness to it. Have you been doing something new?" Hazel thought about her daily habits and smiled. "Just my usual, except for the cayenne, of course." Emily's eyes lit up. "Well, that could be part of it. Cayenne's loaded with antioxidants, you know. They help fight the little bits of damage that build up in the skin over time. It's like giving your body the tools to repair itself from the inside." Hazel considered this. She'd always thought of skincare as something you applied to the surface, but maybe the real work began deeper, with what you fed yourself every day. A week later, Hazel attended her knitting circle at the library. As the women sipped tea and compared yarn colors, her friend Margaret leaned over and said, "You've been looking well lately, Hazel. Your cheeks have a nice color." Hazel chuckled, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Must be all the hot tea and good company." But in her mind, she thought again of that small red spice jar in her kitchen. It wasn't that she was trying to look younger. She'd made her peace with the years long ago. But she found it comforting to think that the care she was taking with her health was showing on her face, like a quiet reflection of how she felt inside. She wasn't chasing youth, she was nurturing vitality, and if that meant her skin carried a little more life in its tone, she was grateful for it. One particularly cold morning, Hazel made herself a breakfast of oatmeal with honey, sliced pear, and a whisper of cayenne. She'd found that the pepper's gentle warmth paired surprisingly well with sweet foods, and the heat seemed to wake her up in ways that coffee no longer did. As she ate, she thought about how much her daily rituals had changed, not through some grand resolution, but through the slow layering of small choices. Later that week, she read an article in the community newsletter about skin health in winter. It talked about hydration, good nutrition, and the role of antioxidants in protecting against dryness and environmental stress. Hazel smiled to herself. She didn't need convincing, she was already living it. When spring finally began to tease its way into town, Hazel went for a walk to the park. The air still carried a bite, but the sun felt warmer and the first crocuses were peeking through the soil. She passed a group of children chasing each other in bright scarves, their laughter spilling into the still, chilly air. A woman on a bench glanced up at Hazel as she walked past and smiled warmly. Hazel felt a flicker of confidence she hadn't noticed in a while, not the kind that comes from vanity, but the kind that comes from feeling good in your own skin, quite literally. That evening, she sat in her sunroom with a cup of tea, the late light painting her walls gold. She thought about all the unexpected ways cayenne pepper had touched her life, her knees, her breathing, her digestion, her sense of energy. And now, even her skin seemed to be quietly thanking her for the care she'd been giving her body. She realized that beauty at her age wasn't about turning back the clock. It was about carrying yourself with the light of someone who still tended to herself, who still believed her well-being was worth the effort. And so, each time she reached for the cayenne jar, Hazel felt a little ripple of gratitude. Not because she believed it was a miracle cure, but because it had reminded her that the smallest daily choices could shape not just how you feel, but how you glow. It happened on an ordinary Thursday morning. Hazel had been standing at the kitchen sink, rinsing out her teacup, when she realized something she hadn't noticed in years. Her hands weren't as cold as they used to be. Normally, winter mornings left her fingers pale and icy, the kind of chill that clung stubbornly no matter how long she stood near the radiator. But today, her hands felt warm, with a faint rosy color returning to her knuckles. She flexed her fingers slowly, curious. For years, Hazel had assumed cold hands, and feet were just part of aging. Poor circulation, she'd been told, nothing to be done except wear thicker socks and keep moving. But now she wondered if maybe, just maybe, something was changing. She thought about her daily cayenne habit, sprinkled over eggs, stirred into tea, folded into hearty soups. She'd read somewhere that cayenne could improve circulation, helping blood flow more freely through the small vessels that sometimes stiffened with time. The thought lingered as she bundled up for her afternoon walk. It was a bright day, the air crisp enough to sting her cheeks. In the past, she would have felt the cold seep into her fingers before she'd even reached the end of her street. But today, her gloves stayed pleasantly warm inside. She walked past the post office, past the bakery with its sweet scent drifting into the air, all the way to the small park near the river. She didn't feel the usual heaviness in her legs, the one that sometimes slowed her steps. Instead, she felt steady. That evening, Hazel decided to mention it during her weekly call with Emily. "My hands and feet aren't staying so cold anymore," she said, half surprised even as she spoke. Emily's response was instant. "That's your circulation, Mom. Capsaicin, the stuff in cayenne, helps open up blood vessels. More blood flow means warmer hands and feet, better delivery of oxygen everywhere." Hazel smiled at the thought of her body's tiny highways and back roads suddenly running more smoothly. The following week, she stopped by Dr. Simons's office for her regular check-in. As he listened to her heart and took her blood pressure, Hazel brought up the changes she'd noticed. Dr. Simons nodded thoughtfully. "Improved circulation can make a big difference in how you feel day to day. It's not just about warmth, it's about nourishing your tissues, supporting your heart, and even helping your brain stay sharp. And yes, cayenne can play a role in that." Hazel left his office with a fresh sense of gratitude. It wasn't that she'd been struggling with severe circulation problems before, but she realized how much those little discomforts, the numb toes, the slow to warm fingers, had been quietly affecting her life. Without them, winter walks felt lighter, knitting was more comfortable, and even writing letters at her desk was easier. One Saturday, she decided to test her newfound energy. She took the longer route to the grocer, the one that wound past the church and down a side street lined with bare maple trees. As she walked, she felt the rhythm of her steps syncing with her breath. The familiar twinge in her knees was still there, but gentler now, and she moved with a quiet confidence. By the time she reached the store, her cheeks were flushed, her hands were warm, and she realized she hadn't thought about turning back once. That night, she made a simple dinner of pan-seared salmon, steamed broccoli, and roasted sweet potatoes. She seasoned the fish with lemon, dill, and a light sprinkle of cayenne, a combination she'd grown to love. As she sat at her kitchen table, she thought about how her meals had transformed over the last few months. They weren't fancy or complicated, but they were nourishing in ways she could feel, from the top of her head to the tips of her toes. Later, while reading in her armchair, Hazel noticed how comfortable she felt. The old restlessness that used to make her shift positions every few minutes was gone. Her body felt settled, supported from within. She realized that this deep, quiet sense of well-being wasn't something she could have bought in a bottle. It had come from the slow, steady work of caring for herself every single day. She thought back to that dusty jar of cayenne pepper, forgotten for so long at the back of her spice rack. Who would have guessed it would become part of such a profound shift in how she moved, breathed, and felt? It wasn't about the spice alone, of course. It was about what it represented. The decision to listen to her body, the willingness to try something new, the commitment to small, consistent steps toward better health. And as she closed her book for the night, Hazel felt certain of one thing. The warmth in her hands was more than just a sign of better circulation. It was a quiet reminder that her body was still capable of change, still able to respond, still ready to carry her forward into the seasons ahead. It was a quiet Saturday morning when Hazel first noticed it. She was standing in her kitchen, sunlight spilling across the table, waiting for her tea to steep. She felt lighter somehow, not just in her body, but in her spirit. It was subtle at first, a hum of energy she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just about having the strength to take longer walks or stand for hours at the church bake sale. This was different. It was a kind of aliveness that reached deeper, touching parts of herself she had quietly set aside. She thought about how, over the past decade, certain parts of her life had gone dim. After her husband Jack passed, she'd focused on keeping the house running, tending her garden, meeting friends for tea. But that deeper spark, the one that made her feel vibrant and fully present, had faded into the background. She had chalked it up to grief, age, and the natural slowing down of life. But now something had shifted. She found herself feeling more engaged, more curious, more open to the world around her. Even simple things like listening to music in the evening or cooking a new recipe felt richer. She was laughing more, really laughing at the little jokes in her knitting circle or the quick quips from Marjorie when they met at the cafe. It was as though her inner light had grown just a bit brighter. One afternoon, while on the phone with Emily, Hazel mentioned it. "I don't know what's come over me, but I've been feeling more alive lately," she said, searching for the right words. Emily chuckled knowingly. "Mom, I'm not surprised. Cayenne doesn't just help your circulation, it can boost your hormones a little too. That better blood flow, it feeds every part of you. Sometimes that means more energy, sometimes it means a little more spark." Hazel laughed at her daughter's choice of words. "Are you saying my spice jar is giving me my groove back?" Emily's laughter rang warm and bright through the phone. "Exactly." Hazel thought about that over the next few days. She realized that her newfound spark wasn't about trying to recapture youth. It was about feeling connected again, to her body, her senses, and even her emotions. The warmth from the cayenne seemed to reach all the way into her bones, waking up parts of her that had been sleeping. She noticed she was paying more attention to her appearance again, not out of vanity, but because she wanted to feel good in her own skin. She brushed her hair a little longer in the mornings, chose her scarves with more care, and even wore her favorite pearl earrings to the market just because. One evening, Marjorie invited her over for supper. The conversation was lively, the food hearty and warm. As they lingered over tea, Marjorie leaned back in her chair and said, "You've been glowing lately, Hazel. There's a liveliness about you." Hazel smiled, stirring her tea slowly. "Maybe it's the company I keep," she teased, but in her mind, she thought about her little red spice jar back home. The shift was not only internal, she noticed her energy spilling into her relationships. She called her sister more often, made plans to visit an old friend she hadn't seen in years, and even volunteered to help organize the church's spring fair. The more she engaged with life, the more life seemed to respond in kind. That sense of connection, of vitality, had a way of multiplying. Hazel knew better than to attribute it all to cayenne pepper. Life was rarely that simple, but she also knew it had been the catalyst, a small daily act that set other changes in motion. The improved circulation, the warmer hands, the lighter step, the clearer breathing, they had all built a foundation for something deeper. Her body felt cared for, and in return, it was giving her back more than she expected. One morning, as she stood by her garden gate, watching the early tulip shoots push through the soil, she thought about how much had changed since she'd first dusted her oatmeal with cayenne. Back then, she'd been looking for relief from pain. Now she was rediscovering joy, pleasure, and a deeper connection to herself. It wasn't just about living longer, it was about living fully. And every time she reached for that little jar of spice, she was reminded that even the smallest changes could ripple out into every corner of her life. It was a rainy Wednesday afternoon when Hazel found herself lingering in the small health aisle of the town's bookstore. She had come in to find a birthday card for her niece, but, as often happened, ended up wandering between shelves. A slim book caught her attention. Foods That Protect Us. She flipped it open to a chapter titled The Power of Spices. Her eyes landed on a familiar name, cayenne pepper. She read slowly, her tea-sipping habit making her cautious with any bold health claim. But this was different. It spoke about capsaicin, the compound that gave cayenne its heat, and how researchers were studying its effects on cancer cells. Some studies suggested that capsaicin might help slow their growth or even trigger cell death in certain cases. Hazel's heart beat a little faster. Cancer had brushed close to her life before. She'd lost a cousin to breast cancer years ago, and a neighbor she'd known since childhood had just started chemotherapy. It was a shadow most people her age had learned to live with, a quiet, lingering worry that rarely left. She stood there in the bookstore for a long time, reading. It wasn't that cayenne pepper was some magical cure, she knew better than that. But the idea that her daily pinch of spice could be doing more than warming her tea, more than easing her knees, more than keeping her hands warm, it made her feel both humbled and oddly empowered. When she got home, she told Emily about what she'd read. "It's not a guarantee," Hazel said, "but it feels like I'm adding another layer of armor." Emily's voice was thoughtful on the other end of the line. "That's the thing about prevention, Mom. It's not about certainty, it's about stacking the odds in your favor. Every little thing you do builds your resilience." That night, Hazel made herself a simple dinner of lentil soup. She stood by the stove, adding her usual pinch of cayenne, and for the first time, she thought of it as more than seasoning. She imagined it as something working quietly inside her, guarding her cells, giving them just a bit more strength against the wear and tear of time. A week later, during her knitting group, the women's conversation drifted, as it often did, to health. Someone mentioned a relative who had just been diagnosed. The air in the room shifted, voices grew softer. Hazel listened, fingers pausing on her yarn. She didn't interrupt with bold claims or advice, but in her heart, she felt grateful for the steps she was already taking, however small they might seem. When she saw Dr. Simons for her routine checkup, she mentioned what she'd been reading. He nodded. The research is still evolving, but cayenne contains compounds that fight oxidative stress. That's one of the key processes behind many chronic diseases, including cancer. Whether it's cayenne or other antioxidant-rich foods, every bit of protection helps. Hazel appreciated his measured tone. It reminded her not to see anything as a miracle, but to respect the steady, quiet power of everyday habits. That spring, as the daffodils began to open along her front walk, Hazel found herself thinking differently about the way she shopped for groceries. Her cart was filling more often with colorful vegetables, leafy greens, berries, and of course, a fresh jar of cayenne pepper. She liked to imagine she was building her own kind of defense system, meal by meal. She began experimenting in the kitchen more, adding cayenne to homemade tomato sauce, stirring it into hummus, even sprinkling a bit over sliced mango for a surprising sweet heat snack. Cooking felt less like a chore and more like a creative way to care for herself. One evening, Emily visited for supper. As they ate roasted chicken with cayenne-spiced carrots, Hazel shared her new perspective. "I think of it as a little daily shield," she said, smiling as she reached for her tea. Emily nodded, her eyes warm. "You've turned it into a habit without forcing it. That's the best kind." Later that night, as Hazel washed the dishes, she realized that while she couldn't control everything about her health, she could choose the small, nourishing acts that gave her a sense of agency. And maybe that was the real gift, not just the physical benefits of the spice, but the quiet confidence that came from knowing she was caring for herself in ways that mattered. She dried her hands, put the clean dishes away, and looked at the little red jar by the stove. It wasn't just a spice anymore. It was a daily reminder that she still had choices, still had influence over her own well-being. And that, she thought, was as powerful as any research paper. Hazel had always enjoyed cooking, but as she grew older, she found herself sticking to familiar dishes, recipes that required little effort and gave reliable comfort. Her kitchen was a place of memories, filled with the scents of hearty soups, fresh bread, and stews that simmered gently on the stove. But ever since cayenne pepper became part of her daily routine, something was changing. Cooking had become a small adventure. One Saturday morning, Hazel pulled out her spice rack and surveyed the jars. The familiar reds and greens, the fragrant jars of herbs and powders. And there, nestled near the front, was the little jar of cayenne pepper. It no longer sat neglected in the back like a forgotten secret. It had become her kitchen companion. She began experimenting, sprinkling cayenne into scrambled eggs for a gentle morning warmth, folding it into tomato sauce for a lively kick, and even stirring a pinch into her afternoon cup of lemon tea. She discovered that the spice brought out flavors she hadn't noticed before, giving ordinary meals a new vibrancy. One afternoon, Emily came over to visit. Hazel had prepared a small lunch of roasted vegetables and quinoa, lightly dusted with cayenne. Emily's eyes lit up as she took a bite. "Mom, this is delicious. You've really found your flavor." Hazel smiled, pleased with the compliment. "It's easy, really, just a little here and there." Over the weeks, Hazel developed a few favorite ways to include cayenne in her meals. She learned to balance the heat with sweetness, pairing the spice with honey in her oatmeal or with ripe mango slices for a surprising treat. She found that adding cayenne to soups and stews not only enhanced the taste, but also made her feel warm and comforted from the inside out. Cooking with cayenne became more than just a health practice. It became a creative expression. Hazel started to invite friends over for simple dinners, eager to share not just food, but the story of her journey. She would laugh as she told them how a little pinch of red powder had changed the way she felt. Inside and out, even when preparing a quick snack, Hazel found ways to include cayenne. She sprinkled it over popcorn with a touch of olive oil, creating a spicy twist that surprised and delighted her. She added it to homemade salad dressings, mixing it with olive oil, lemon, and a hint of garlic. Each meal felt like an opportunity to nourish her body and delight her senses. When she spoke with Dr. Simons, he praised her for finding a sustainable way to include the spice in her diet. "Consistency is key," he said. "The benefits come with regular use, not occasional bursts. You've found a balance that works for you." Hazel felt proud, not just of the changes in her health, but of the joyful way she had embraced them. The kitchen, once a place of routine, had become a space of warmth and possibility. Each sprinkle of cayenne was a small act of care, a way to connect with herself and with those she loved. And Hazel knew that this simple spice, so easy to add to her meals, was more than just a flavor. It was part of her story of healing and hope. As Hazel's journey with cayenne pepper grew, so did her curiosity. She loved the way this tiny spice had quietly changed her life, easing her aches, warming her hands, brightening her skin, and adding a new spark to her days. But one afternoon, as she sat sipping her familiar lemon cayenne tea, she felt a little twinge of caution. She remembered Emily's gentle advice. "It's great, Mom, but make sure you don't overdo it." Hazel realized that while cayenne pepper was a gift, it wasn't something to be taken lightly. That evening, she decided to call Dr. Simons, wanting to understand more about how to use this spice wisely. When he answered, his calm voice put her at ease immediately. "Hazel, cayenne pepper is wonderful for many reasons," he explained, "but it's important to remember that it can be quite strong. Some people may experience burning sensations in their mouth or throat if they use too much. Others might find it irritates their stomach, especially if they have sensitive digestion." Hazel nodded as she listened. She had felt a slight warmth on some mornings, but nothing uncomfortable. Still, the doctor's words reminded her to pay attention to her body's signals. He continued, "Certain health conditions mean cayenne should be used with caution or avoided altogether. People with gastritis, ulcers, or irritable bowel syndrome might find it aggravates their symptoms. Also, if you're pregnant, breastfeeding, or on blood-thinning medications, it's wise to consult your healthcare provider before using cayenne regularly." The seriousness in his tone wasn't meant to scare Hazel, but to empower her to use this spice safely. She thought about the times she'd added a little more than a pinch or skipped meals and wondered if she'd pushed herself too far. "Moderation is key," Dr. Simons emphasized. "Generally, 1 to 2 small pinches per day is safe for most people. And if you notice any discomfort, it's best to reduce the amount or stop and talk to your doctor." After the call, Hazel felt grateful for the guidance. She realized that her journey with cayenne was not just about adding a spice, but about learning to listen deeply to her body and respecting its limits. She also made a mental note to share this wisdom with her friends and neighbors, many of whom had expressed interest in trying cayenne but didn't know how to use it safely. The next week at knitting group, Hazel gently brought up the topic. She told her friends about the benefits she'd experienced but also shared the importance of moderation and caution. Marjorie, ever curious, asked, "So how do you know if you're using too much?" Hazel smiled warmly. "If you feel burning, nausea, or any irritation, that's your body telling you to slow down. It's better to start small and see how you feel." Her friends appreciated the honesty, and the conversation became a gentle reminder that natural remedies are powerful but must be respected. That night, as Hazel prepared her evening tea, she carefully measured her cayenne, just a small pinch, just like before, and thought about how this spice had become part of a balanced life, not just a quick fix. She knew that her health was a lifelong journey filled with learning, adjustment, and kindness to herself and her body. And as she settled into her favorite chair by the window, watching the stars twinkle softly, she felt a quiet peace. She was no longer just a woman chasing relief from pain or cold. She was a woman who cared deeply for herself, who embraced small, thoughtful choices, and who understood that healing is as much about wisdom as it is about wonder. After her conversation with Dr. Simons, Hazel felt a growing responsibility, not only to care for herself, but also to understand when cayenne pepper might not be the right choice for everyone. As much as she loved the warmth and energy it brought, she realized that this little red spice, powerful as it was, wasn't suitable for everyone. One afternoon, while preparing her lunch, Hazel reflected on the importance of knowing your body. She thought about friends who had different health concerns, her neighbor who suffered from severe acid reflux, a cousin with hemorrhoids, and others with digestive troubles. Could cayenne pepper help them, or might it make things worse? Her next visit to Dr. Simons brought clarity. "Hazel," he said kindly, "cayenne pepper can be incredibly beneficial, but it's not for everyone. People with conditions like gastritis, ulcers, pancreatitis, hemorrhoids, or severe irritable bowel syndrome should avoid it or consult their doctor first." Hazel listened attentively. She had always thought of spices as harmless additions, but now she understood that their intensity could be too much for sensitive systems. Dr. Simons continued, "Also, children under 2 years old, pregnant women, and breastfeeding mothers should be cautious with cayenne. Their bodies are more sensitive, and it's best to avoid any potential irritation." Hazel thought of her grandchildren, far away but always close in her heart. She pictured them playing in the garden, carefree and curious. She realized how important it was to share this knowledge, not to discourage, but to protect. She remembered Emily's wise words, "Natural remedies have power, but that power comes with responsibility." Hazel nodded silently, grateful for the care behind those words. That evening, Hazel invited Marjorie over for tea. As they sipped their drinks, Hazel shared what she had learned. "It's wonderful to have something natural to help," she said, "but we have to be careful. What's good for one person might not be for another." Marjorie nodded thoughtfully. "It makes sense. I've always been cautious with spicy food because of my stomach, but I never thought about it this way." Hazel smiled. "Exactly. It's about knowing your body and listening to it. If something doesn't feel right, it's okay to say no." The conversation left Hazel feeling even more connected to her community and her own journey. She realized that health was not just personal, but shared, a web of care and respect. In the days that followed, Hazel found herself more mindful of her use of cayenne. She kept the amounts moderate, sticking to 1 or 2 pinches a day, and paid close attention to how she felt. If she ever noticed any discomfort, a slight burn in her stomach, a harsh sensation in her throat, she adjusted accordingly, knowing that kindness to her body was the best medicine. She also made sure to keep conversations open with her doctor, asking questions and staying informed. It gave her confidence and peace of mind. One sunny morning, as Hazel walked through the park, she thought about the journey she had been on, from skepticism to curiosity, from discovery to care. Cayenne pepper was no longer just a spice on her shelf. It was a symbol of her commitment to herself. Not just to live, but to live wisely, kindly, and fully. And with that thought, Hazel smiled, ready for whatever came next. Hazel sat by the window one quiet evening, the soft light of the setting sun painting her kitchen in gentle gold. She held her cup of tea, a familiar blend with just a pinch of cayenne pepper, a habit that had become part of her daily ritual. The journey she had taken with that little jar of red powder felt almost surreal now, a gentle transformation woven into the fabric of her everyday life. She thought back to those early days when pain and stiffness shadowed her mornings, when breathing felt heavy and uncertain. She remembered the doubts, the hesitations, and the slow unfolding of change, step by step. It hadn't been about quick fixes or miracles, but about small, steady acts of care, listening to her body, learning from her experiences, and embracing the little things that made a difference. Hazel smiled as she realized how far she'd come. The warmth in her joints, the clearer breaths, the glow in her skin, all were reminders of a renewed vitality. But beyond the physical changes, there was something deeper, a rekindled connection with herself, a confidence that she was an active participant in her own well-being. Her thoughts drifted to the friends she'd shared this journey with, the conversations about safety, moderation, and respect for one's body. She felt grateful for the wisdom she'd gathered, not just from doctors and research, but from listening deeply to her own needs. As she sipped her tea, Hazel felt a quiet hope. She knew that every body is different, every journey unique, but she also believed in the power of small steps, the kind that anyone could take. Whether it was a pinch of cayenne pepper, a short walk, or a moment of mindful breathing, these choices mattered. She imagined viewers, like herself, watching and wondering if they too could make a change. Hazel wanted them to know that it wasn't about grand gestures or perfect routines. It was about kindness to oneself, patience, and the courage to try. The little jar of cayenne pepper on her kitchen shelf had become a symbol of that courage, a reminder that healing is often quiet, gentle, and deeply personal. With a soft smile, Hazel set down her cup and looked out the window. The garden outside was waking up, buds swelling on branches, the promise of new growth stirring in the soil. She felt ready for the seasons ahead, filled with the quiet strength that comes from caring for oneself every day. Her health, she knew, would thank her for this. As we followed Hazel's story, we've seen how a simple choice, a tiny pinch of cayenne pepper, began a quiet transformation in her life. From easing the stubborn aches that slowed her steps to clearing her breathing and warming her hands on cold mornings, each small change brought Hazel closer to feeling like herself again. Along the way, she discovered more than just physical relief, a renewed connection with her body, a spark of vitality, and a deeper sense of care for her well-being. Hazel's journey wasn't about miracles or overnight cures, it was about patience, listening closely to her own needs and embracing simple, sustainable habits. She learned to balance curiosity with caution, respecting the power of this little spice and understanding when it might not be right for everyone. Through it all, she grew stronger, not just in body but in spirit. For many of us, especially as we age, health can feel fragile or out of reach. But Hazel's story reminds us that change is possible, even in small steps. It starts with a decision to listen to our bodies, to try something new, to care gently and consistently. So today, consider this. What small choice could you make to support your health? Maybe it's as simple as adding a pinch of cayenne pepper to your meals, taking a short daily walk, or choosing to nourish your body in ways that feel good. Your journey doesn't have to be perfect, it only has to begin. Because your health, your vitality, and your joy are worth every small step. And just like Hazel, your body is ready to respond. Take that step today.